By 1807, Napoleon Bonaparte controlled almost all of Europe. He'd crushed the Austrians at Austerlitz, destroyed Prussia at Jena, and forced Russia to terms at Friedland. His grand army seemed unstoppable, his tactical genius unmatched. Yet within a year, he'd make a decision that would slowly destroy his empire from within. He'd invade Spain, expecting quick victory like everywhere else. Instead, he'd commit over 300,000 troops to a grinding, brutal war that would last 6 years and cost France 200,000 casualties. Napoleon himself would later call it the Spanish ulcer, the wound that never healed and slowly bled his empire to death. Britain sent a small expeditionary force under Lieutenant-General Arthur Wellesley, who'd become the Duke of Wellington, to support Spanish and Portuguese resistance. Starting with barely 30,000 men, Wellington would spend 6 years implementing a strategy of patience, never risking his army in battles he might lose, always retreating when threatened, bleeding French forces through small victories and guerrilla warfare. By 1814, he'd driven every French marshal from the Iberian Peninsula, killed or captured tens of thousands of French veterans Napoleon desperately needed elsewhere, and created an army of Peninsular veterans who'd form his corps at Waterloo. This is how one British general and Spanish guerrillas destroyed Napoleon's empire slowly, methodically, and completely. Napoleon's continental system was supposed to strangle Britain economically by forbidding European nations from trading with the island. After the Berlin Decrees of 1806, every country Napoleon controlled had to comply or face invasion. Portugal refused. It had been Britain's ally since 1386, the oldest alliance in European history, and its economy depended on British trade. Napoleon demanded Spain allow French troops to cross Spanish territory to invade Portugal. King Charles IV, weak and dominated by his chief minister Godoy, agreed in the Treaty of Fontainebleau in October 1807. But allowing French troops through was different from what happened next. By spring 1808, over 100,000 French soldiers occupied northern Spain, ostensibly heading for Portugal, but actually seizing Spanish fortresses. In May, Napoleon summoned the Spanish royal family to Bayonne in France, and forced Charles IV and his son Ferdinand VII to abdicate. He installed his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, as King of Spain. The Spanish population reacted with fury. This wasn't alliance, this was conquest. On May 2, 1808, Madrid erupted in spontaneous uprising against French occupation. French troops under Marshal Murat suppressed the rebellion brutally. The following morning, May 3rd, French firing squads executed hundreds of Spanish rebels. Goya's famous painting captures that moment, Spanish civilians being shot by French soldiers whilst others wait their turn in horror. The executions didn't terrify Spain into submission. They ignited nationwide resistance. Local governing councils called juntas formed across Spain, rejecting Joseph Bonaparte's authority entirely. Spanish guerrillas began attacking French supply convoys, assassinating French collaborators, and burning anything useful to the occupiers. The French responded with savage reprisals, burning villages, executing civilians suspected of supporting guerrillas, and implementing collective punishment. Rather than suppressing resistance, this brutality intensified it. Every French atrocity created more guerrillas seeking revenge. Every Spanish atrocity against French stragglers hardened French troops and made them more brutal. The cycle of violence escalated beyond anyone's control. Then, in July 1808, something unprecedented happened. At Bailén in southern Spain, Spanish General Castaños defeated French General Dupont's 18,000 troops, forcing their surrender. This was the first major French defeat in open battle since Napoleon's rise to power. Psychologically, the impact was enormous. French troops weren't invincible after all. Spanish morale soared. Napoleon was apoplectic with rage at the humiliation. He'd have to intervene personally. Britain saw opportunity in Spain's uprising. A rebellion against French occupation meant a chance to open a continental front against Napoleon without fighting alone. The government dispatched Lieutenant-General Sir Arthur Wellesley with 13,000 troops to Portugal in August 1808. Wellesley won quick victories at Roliça and Vimeiro, defeating the French and establishing British presence. But the controversial Convention of Sintra allowed French troops to evacuate Portugal with their equipment, and Wellesley was recalled to Britain to explain. Nevertheless, the British had their foothold. Napoleon wouldn't tolerate Spanish defiance. In November 1808, he arrived personally with 200,000 reinforcements, veterans from Jena and Austerlitz. Within weeks, he'd smashed Spanish armies that tried meeting him in conventional battles. At Somosierra on December 4th, Polish cavalry charged uphill into Spanish artillery positions and somehow broke through. Madrid fell, Joseph Bonaparte was restored, and the Spanish regular armies scattered. A small British force under Sir John Moore, trapped at Salamanca with 20,000 men, had to retreat desperately toward the coast to avoid being caught. Through bitter winter conditions across mountainous terrain, Moore's army fled with Marshal Soult's 25,000 French pursuing. Thousands collapsed from exhaustion, cold, and hunger before any fighting occurred. At Corunna in January 1809, Moore's rearguard fought off French attacks long enough for the Royal Navy to evacuate the survivors. Moore himself died from wounds during the battle. Napoleon left Spain in January 1809, believing he'd conquered it. Spanish armies were defeated, the British expelled, Joseph reinstated. He returned to other concerns. Austria was preparing for war again. What Napoleon didn't grasp was that defeating Spanish armies wasn't the same as defeating Spain. The guerrillas remained, the juntas still governed locally, and popular resistance was intensifying. The war he thought he'd won in 3 months would consume 6 years, destroy 200,000 French soldiers, and ultimately contribute to his downfall. In April 1809, Arthur Wellesley returned to Portugal as commander-in-chief with government backing and a clear mission: defend Portugal, support Spanish resistance, and tie down French forces. He'd soon become Viscount Wellington and eventually Duke, but at 40 years old, he was entering his prime with hard lessons learned from India and the brief 1808 campaign. He commanded roughly 26,000 British troops and 16,000 Portuguese soldiers being trained by British officers. Facing him were somewhere between 250,000 and 300,000 French troops scattered across Spain, a seemingly impossible disparity. Wellington's assessment of the strategic situation was brutally realistic. The French had overwhelming numbers on paper, but guerrilla warfare tied down perhaps 100,000 or more in garrison duties, protecting supply lines and hunting insurgents. Spanish regular armies kept reforming despite defeats, forcing the French to maintain field armies watching them. Most crucially, French forces were dispersed across Spain with poor coordination between marshals who competed rather than cooperated. Wellington concluded that France couldn't concentrate enough strength to crush him, whilst simultaneously holding down Spanish resistance. His strategy would be Fabian, named after the Roman general who'd defeated Hannibal by avoiding decisive battle. Wellington would never risk his army in a fight he might lose. He'd attack only when advantage was his, use Portugal as a secure base, and bleed French strength through patience rather than seeking one climactic victory. This patience required transforming Portugal's army into an effective force. Marshal William Beresford, a British officer, was appointed to command Portuguese troops and implemented British training, equipment, and organization. Portuguese brigades were integrated directly into British divisions, fighting alongside redcoats rather than as separate Allied contingents. By 1810, Portuguese soldiers were nearly equal in quality to British regulars, and Wellington had effectively doubled his field army to around 60,000 without requesting more troops from Britain. Meanwhile, he conceived something extraordinary: a secret defensive masterwork that would guarantee Portugal's survival if the French ever invaded with overwhelming force. The lines of Torres Vedras were 3 successive defensive lines built into hills north of Lisbon, protecting Portugal's capital and its vital port connection to British supply ships. Construction began in October 1809 using Portuguese civilian labor and soldiers, creating 152 redoubts, small fortified positions, connected by earthworks, with artillery commanding every approach. Rivers and ravines were incorporated as obstacles, and the entire zone in front of the lines was designated for scorched earth. All food and supplies would be removed if invasion threatened. The scale was massive, 29 miles of fortifications that could be defended by 40,000 troops against perhaps 100,000 attackers. Most remarkably, Wellington kept it secret. The French had no idea these fortifications existed until they marched right into them. In July 1809, Wellington ventured into Spain for his first major offensive, joining Spanish forces at Talavera. His 20,000 British combined with 33,000 Spanish to face Marshal Victor's 46,000 French. The battle fought on July 27-28 was desperate. A French night attack on the 27th nearly broke the British line with hand-to-hand fighting in darkness. The following day, major French assaults were repulsed, but at cost, 5,400 British casualties. The Spanish contributed little and nearly abandoned Wellington during critical moments. Tactically, Wellington had won, the French withdrew, but strategically he'd learned a harsh lesson. Spanish regular armies were too unreliable to trust. He'd coordinate with them loosely, but never again stake British survival on Spanish military performance. He withdrew back to Portugal and wouldn't venture far from his secure base for another year. The real war against French occupation wasn't being fought in pitched battles. It was being waged daily across Spain by guerrilleros, irregular fighters who knew every village, mountain pass, and forest in their regions. They ambushed supply convoys, murdered collaborators, destroyed bridges, and melted back into the civilian population. French response was predictably brutal. Mass executions, village burnings, hostage-taking. But brutality didn't work. For every guerrilla killed, French atrocities created two more seeking revenge. The occupation became a nightmare for French soldiers who were never safe outside fortified towns. A convoy traveling from France to Madrid needed over 1,000 escorts and still might be attacked. Tens of thousands of French troops were tied down in garrison duties rather than fighting Wellington's field army. The guerrillas couldn't defeat France militarily, but they made French occupation unsustainable logistically and psychologically. Wellington cultivated an intelligence network through Spanish guerrillas and sympathetic locals that gave him nearly perfect information about French positions, strength, and movements. The French, isolated by hostile populations, operated in intelligence darkness. Wellington often read intercepted French dispatches before the intended recipients. He always knew where French armies were, they rarely knew where he was. Combined with the Portuguese army, the Torres Vedras fortifications, Royal Navy supply access, and Spanish guerrillas bleeding French strength, Wellington had constructed a system that Napoleon's empire couldn't break. Now he'd wait patiently for the perfect moment to strike back, even if that moment took years to arrive. Napoleon's frustration with Spain had reached breaking point by 1810. 3 years into what should have been a quick conquest, French forces controlled major cities but little else. Guerrillas cost France perhaps 100 casualties daily. Multiple marshals commanded separate armies with no real coordination. Napoleon needed someone brilliant to end this embarrassment. He chose Marshal André Massena, one of his ablest commanders, Victor of Zurich, and the legendary defender of Genoa. At 52, Massena remained capable and experienced. His mission was clear: invade Portugal, destroy Wellington's army, and finally end British presence in the Peninsula. Massena assembled 65,000 quality troops and began his invasion in June 1810. First, he had to reduce the border fortresses blocking his route. Ciudad Rodrigo fell after brutal siege. Then Almeida exploded when a lucky French shell hit the main magazine, killing 500 defenders instantly. These sieges consumed months of summer campaigning weather, whilst Wellington observed from distance, letting Massena exhaust his army before the real fighting began. On September 27th, Wellington offered battle at Busaco Ridge, a 10-mile-long position with steep slopes perfect for defence. He commanded 25,000 British and 25,000 Portuguese against Massena's 65,000. The French assumed Wellington would retreat rather than fight at such numerical disadvantage. Instead, when French columns attacked uphill, British and Portuguese infantry fired down into their formations with devastating effect. The fighting was savage where French troops reached the crest, but British bayonet countercharges drove them back bloodily. French casualties reached 4,500 against Allied losses of 1,250. Then Wellington did something Massena didn't expect. Having bloodied the French thoroughly, he retreated toward Lisbon as planned. Busaco wasn't meant to stop Massena, just make him bleed. Massena pursued, expecting to assault Lisbon and end the campaign. Instead, in October, his advance guard encountered massive fortification lines stretching across the hills, the lines of Torres Vedras. The French were stunned. They'd had no intelligence these fortifications existed. Massena studied the 152 redoubts, connecting earthworks, natural obstacles, and 40,000 defenders, then realized the truth. Attacking would be suicide. His only options were retreat or wait outside the lines, hoping Wellington emerged. Wellington, comfortable behind fortifications with the Royal Navy supplying through Lisbon, had no intention of emerging. For 5 months, Massena's army sat outside the lines, slowly starving. The Portuguese civilian population had been evacuated from the region and all food removed, scorched earth that worked horrifyingly well. Perhaps 40,000 Portuguese civilians died from exposure, starvation, and disease during this displacement, a cost rarely mentioned in British accounts. The French army suffered equally. Horses died from lack of fodder. Soldiers deserted in increasing numbers. Disease spread through malnourished troops. Guerrillas massacred any foraging parties that ventured out. Supply convoys from France had to traverse over 300 miles of hostile territory and arrived irregularly, if at all. Wellington simply waited behind his fortifications, perfectly supplied, whilst Massena's veteran army withered. In March 1811, Massena admitted defeat and ordered retreat. His army, starving and exhausted, withdrew towards Spain with Wellington following cautiously. The French burned and looted everything during their retreat. Portuguese guerrillas murdered isolated French soldiers without mercy. Massena lost roughly 25,000 men, killed, died of disease, deserted or captured, without Wellington risking a single major battle. Massena tried one last time in May at Fuentes de Oñoro, attempting to relieve the French-held fortress of Almeida with 48,000 troops against Wellington's 34,000. 3 days of intense fighting nearly collapsed Wellington's right flank on May 5th, but he conducted a masterful fighting withdrawal under pressure. Tactically, the battle was nearly a draw, but Massena retreated afterwards and Almeida fell to Wellington. Napoleon recalled Massena in disgrace. One of France's best marshals had been defeated not through climactic battle, but through patience, fortifications, and systematic bleeding. Wellington's strategy of never risking what he couldn't afford to lose had worked perfectly. The Portuguese border was secure, British presence guaranteed, and now Wellington would consider taking the offensive into Spain itself. By 1812, the strategic situation had shifted decisively. French forces in Spain still numbered around 230,000, but they were dispersed, demoralized, and increasingly undersupplied. Napoleon was preparing his catastrophic invasion of Russia and couldn't spare reinforcements for the Peninsula. Marshal Marmont commanded the army of Portugal with roughly 50,000 troops, whilst Wellington had built his force to 48,000 British and Portuguese, with improving Spanish allies. Most importantly, Wellington now commanded fortresses on both sides of the Portuguese border, giving him secure bases for offensive operations into Spain. In January 1812, Wellington besieged Ciudad Rodrigo in the middle of winter when the French didn't expect campaigning. The assault came on January 19th, after just 11 days of siege, Wellington attacking rapidly rather than waiting for prolonged bombardment. British troops stormed the breaches and captured the fortress, though 300 casualties demonstrated the cost. Afterwards, discipline collapsed as British soldiers sacked the city brutally, an ugly reminder that even Wellington's veteran army could descend into savagery. But strategically, the northern invasion route into Spain was now open. Badajoz in the south was harder. The fortress had held against previous British attempts, and its French garrison of 5,000 defended formidable walls. Wellington's siege from March 17 to April 6 created breaches through artillery bombardment, then ordered a night assault. What followed was the bloodiest night of the entire war. British troops attacked the breaches in darkness against desperate French defenders. The fighting was point-blank, savage, with French pouring musket fire and grenades down into attackers struggling through the gaps. 5,000 British casualties fell in that single night, the worst siege losses Wellington ever suffered. When the fortress finally fell, British troops went completely out of control, sacking Badajoz for 3 days with such violence that Wellington reportedly wept at the carnage and indiscipline. But both border fortresses were now British-held. Spain lay open. Wellington and Marmont spent June and July 1812 marching parallel to each other near Salamanca, neither willing to fight without advantage. Weeks passed with both armies maneuvering through dust and heat, veteran commanders watching for any mistake. On July 22, Marmont made his error. Attempting to get around Wellington's flank, he extended his line during movement, opening gaps between divisions. Wellington observed from a hillside and saw the opportunity instantly. His famous exclamation, "By God, that will do," was followed by immediate orders to attack. His 3rd Division under Pakenham smashed into the separated French left, whilst British cavalry exploited the breakthrough. Marmont was wounded early in the battle, creating French command chaos. Within 40 minutes, the French army was routed. Casualties told the story. 14,000 French, including 7,000 captured, against 5,000 Allied losses. Salamanca demonstrated that Wellington wasn't merely a defensive specialist, he could win attacking when the circumstances favored him. On August 12, 1812, Wellington entered Madrid to scenes of Spanish jubilation. Joseph Bonaparte had evacuated the capital, fleeing to Valencia with French forces. The Spanish population treated Wellington as a liberator, and psychologically, the victory resonated across Europe. Napoleon's brother had been driven from Spain's capital by a British general. Wellington's military reputation, previously dismissed by some as merely competent defensive fighting, now stood alongside Napoleon's marshals. But Wellington overreached. In September, he besieged Burgos fortress in northern Spain without sufficient siege artillery. The fortress proved stronger than expected, and by October, French armies were concentrating against him. Wellington was forced to retreat back toward Portugal, abandoning Madrid to French reoccupation. The Burgos failure cost 2,000 casualties and reminded Wellington that his cautious strategy existed for good reasons. Yet 1812 brought catastrophe for France that dwarfed Spanish setbacks. Napoleon invaded Russia in June with 600,000 men and retreated in December with perhaps 100,000 freezing survivors. The Grand Army was destroyed. France couldn't send reinforcements to Spain anymore. In fact, veteran troops were being withdrawn from the Peninsula to rebuild forces in Germany. The replacements arriving in Spain were younger conscripts with less training and experience. Wellington would face weaker opposition in 1813, whilst Napoleon would be fighting for survival against a revitalized coalition in Germany. The Spanish ulcer had been bleeding France slowly for 4 years. Now, with Napoleon's Russian disaster, Wellington was ready to finish the job. By spring 1813, Wellington commanded roughly 80,000 British and Portuguese troops, plus 30,000 Spanish allies, a veteran army that had spent 5 years learning to defeat French tactics. Facing them were approximately 200,000 demoralized French soldiers whose best units had been withdrawn for Napoleon's desperate campaigns in Germany. Joseph Bonaparte and Marshal Jourdan commanded French forces in Spain, both mediocre leaders compared to Napoleon's best marshals. Wellington planned to drive them completely out of Spain by advancing through the north, turning French defensive positions and forcing them back to France itself. His advance in May-June caught French forces off guard. Poor intelligence meant they didn't know Wellington's location until his army appeared, perfectly positioned to cut their supply lines. Joseph attempted to concentrate forces at Vitoria, in the Basque country, where the French had established a major supply base. On June 21st, Wellington attacked with 78,000 Allied troops against 58,000 French. His plan was classically Wellingtonian, multiple columns converging simultaneously from 3 directions. French defenders found themselves overwhelmed from multiple angles, with no coherent defense possible. Some units fought hard, but coordinated resistance collapsed as Allied forces converged on Vitoria. Joseph Bonaparte fled, abandoning the entire French baggage train containing the army's treasury, art looted from Spanish palaces, and crucial military documents. Wellington's soldiers broke discipline completely, looting French baggage for days, whilst officers struggled to restore order. French casualties reached 8,000, whilst Allied losses were 5,000. Strategically, Spain was effectively liberated except for small coastal enclaves. The psychological impact of Vitoria resonated across Europe. Austria, watching Napoleon's vulnerability, joined the Sixth Coalition against France. Wellington was promoted to Field Marshal and appointed Spanish Generalissimo. The French retreated to the Pyrenees Mountains, attempting to defend France's border. Napoleon, desperate to stabilize the situation, sent Marshal Soult, one of his ablest commanders, to take command. Soult immediately counterattacked through Pyrenees passes in July, attempting to drive Wellington back into Spain. At Sororan on July 28-30, Wellington defeated Soult's assaults in desperate mountain fighting. French troops made determined attempts to break through, but were repulsed with 13,000 casualties against 7,000 Allied. By August, Soult's counteroffensive had failed completely. On October 7th, Wellington crossed the Bidasoa River, marking the Spanish-French border, the first Allied troops on French soil since 1792. The psychological reversal was complete, France being invaded after years of occupying its neighbours. At Nivelles on November 10th, Wellington assaulted French fortified positions in the French Pyrenees and drove Soult back again. At the Nive River in December, Soult counterattacked Wellington's divided forces, but was defeated after 5 days of fighting. After winter quarters, Wellington resumed his offensive in February 1814. At Orthez on February 27th, he defeated Soult again, driving French forces deeper into southern France toward Toulouse. The final battle came on April 10th at Toulouse itself. Wellington assaulted the city in hard fighting, costing 4,600 Allied casualties and 3,200 French before capturing it. Then news arrived that made the battle tragically pointless. Napoleon had abdicated on April 6th. The war was over. Toulouse had been fought after peace was already made, unnecessary casualties on both sides, because communication was too slow to reach the armies in time. The Peninsular War had lasted 6 years. French casualties exceeded 200,000 killed, wounded, or captured. British losses reached 40,000, Portuguese around 25,000, Spanish military perhaps 50,000, with civilian deaths possibly 200,000 to 500,000 from warfare, disease, and starvation. Wellington had defeated every French marshal sent against him: Junot, Massena, Marmont, Jourdan, Soult. He'd proven that patient, defensive strategy, combined with Portuguese alliance and Spanish guerrilla support, could bleed France dry over years of attritional warfare. Napoleon's Spanish ulcer had cost him an entire army's worth of veterans he desperately needed elsewhere. And in 1815, many of those Peninsular veterans would stand with Wellington at Waterloo to finish what Spain had started. Napoleon himself, exiled on St. Helena in 1816, admitted that Spain was the Spanish ulcer that destroyed him. Unlike his other campaigns where he achieved quick victories or suffered quick defeats, Spain consumed 6 years with no resolution until his empire collapsed. The numbers tell the story of slow destruction. France committed over 300,000 troops to Spain at peak strength, with perhaps 600,000 total sent over 6 years, including replacements. Casualties exceeded 200,000. roughly 50,000 to 70,000 killed in action, 80,000 to 100,000 dead from disease, 40,000 permanently wounded, 30,000 captured, and thousands more deserted. These were veterans Napoleon desperately needed elsewhere. The strategic disaster was dispersion. Between 200,000 and 300,000 French troops fighting in Spain couldn't fight in Germany or Russia. Best units were constantly drained to replace Spanish losses. Capable marshals like Massena, Soult, Ney, and Jourdan spent years tied down in the Peninsula instead of commanding elsewhere. Napoleon couldn't personally command everywhere simultaneously. When he invaded Russia in 1812 with a weaker army, partly because of Spanish commitments, the disaster was magnified. When he fought in Germany in 1813, undermanned because troops remained in Spain, his position was untenable. Guerrilla warfare's impact is harder to quantify, but strategically decisive. Perhaps 100,000 French troops were occupied garrisoning cities, guarding supply routes, and hunting insurgents, rather than fighting Wellington's field army. Daily attrition from guerrilla attacks cost an estimated 100 to 300 French casualties daily, small numbers individually, but devastating cumulatively over 6 years. Convoys needed 1,000-man escorts and were still attacked. French soldiers were never safe, creating constant psychological stress. The brutalization cycle of atrocities hardened troops, but reduced military effectiveness. Modern counterinsurgency parallels are obvious. Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq. Any occupation facing popular resistance confronts similar problems. Wellington's contribution was tying down French field armies and preventing concentration whilst demonstrating French could be beaten. His Portuguese alliance created the secure base he operated from. His coordination with Spanish regulars and guerrillas, however imperfect, supported resistance without requiring direct control. Victories at Salamanca and Vitoria inspired resistance across Europe by proving French weren't invincible. And crucially, Peninsular veterans would form the core of Wellington's Waterloo Army in 1815, battle-hardened troops who'd spent years defeating French tactics. Britain's financial support mattered enormously. Subsidies paid Spanish juntas and Portuguese government. British weapons, uniforms, and equipment equipped Spanish and Portuguese forces. The cost reached millions of pounds over 6 years, but strategically it was worth it to tie down French armies. This was Britain's traditional strategy: pay continental allies to fight France whilst maintaining naval supremacy and limited land commitments. The reputation cost weakened Napoleon's authority across Europe. French invincibility was myth after Spanish resistance succeeded. Multiple marshals defeated by Wellington demonstrated French weren't unbeatable. Guerrilla success proved regular armies vulnerable to insurgency. The 1813 German uprising against French occupation was partly inspired by Spanish example. Napoleon's personal authority suffered from Spanish failure when subject peoples saw resistance could work. From Spain's perspective, the human cost was catastrophic. Military casualties reached 50,000 or more, but civilian deaths estimated between 200,000 and 500,000 from disease, starvation, and massacres by both sides dwarf military losses. Cities were destroyed, agriculture disrupted, treasures looted, and social trauma from years of atrocities left deep scars. Yet Spaniards remember this as their war of independence, a national struggle against foreign occupation that succeeded despite terrible cost. The military lessons remain relevant. Guerrilla warfare can defeat conventional armies if sustained and supported. Logistics matter more than tactics. French, living off the land, failed in hostile territory. Popular resistance makes occupation unsustainable. Overextension defeats empires when they can't concentrate force everywhere. Wellington's Fabian patience worked against an invincible enemy. British naval power enabled the entire strategy by guaranteeing supply. And coalition warfare, combining regular forces with irregulars despite friction, multiplied effectiveness. These lessons would be relearned painfully in later centuries, but Spain had already demonstrated them between 1808 and 1814. Napoleon dominated Europe by 1807, seemingly unstoppable after Austerlitz, Jena, and Friedland. 6 years later, 200,000 French casualties in Spain had bled his empire dry, whilst Wellington stood undefeated. The transformation from French invincibility to imperial collapse began not with dramatic climactic battles, but with patient grinding warfare that consumed French strength daily over years. Wellington succeeded where others failed through defensive genius, refusing to risk battles he might lose, using Portuguese border fortresses as secure bases, and coordinating with Spanish guerrillas who made French occupation logistically impossible. His intelligence network provided perfect information whilst hostile Spanish populations left French commanders operating blind. Napoleon failed in Spain through overconfidence, assuming Spanish would accept Joseph Bonaparte like other conquered nations accepted French rule. He underestimated popular resistance and guerrilla warfare's effectiveness. French forces were overextended. Troops in Spain couldn't fight in Russia or Germany. Living off hostile land proved impossible when the population destroyed supplies rather than feed occupiers. Brutal reprisals increased resistance instead of suppressing it. Multiple marshals commanded without coordination until too late, and Napoleon's absence meant no unified command existed. The human cost demands acknowledgement. French casualties exceeded 200,000. British lost 40,000. Portuguese 25,000. Spanish military 50,000, with Spanish civilian deaths possibly reaching 200,000 to 500,000 from warfare, disease, and starvation. Hundreds of thousands of families destroyed, Spain's economy ruined for decades, heritage lost, generations traumatized. Victory's cost was measured in suffering that statistics inadequately capture. Strategically, Spain drained resources Napoleon needed desperately. 300,000 troops tied down, veterans killed unavailable for Russia in 1812 or Germany in 1813, capable marshals exhausted or defeated. French invincibility myth shattered, emboldening resistance elsewhere. Austria joined the Sixth Coalition, partly because Vitoria proved Napoleon vulnerable. At Waterloo in 1815, Napoleon faced an army including Peninsular veterans who'd spent years learning to defeat French tactics. Modern warfare lessons from the Peninsula remain relevant. Guerrilla warfare defeats conventional armies when sustained by popular support. Logistics determine outcomes more than tactics. Professionals understand this, whilst amateurs focus on battles. Patient Fabian strategy works against aggressive enemies if you can sustain it politically. Intelligence from sympathetic populations provides decisive advantage. Coalition warfare multiplies effectiveness despite coordination difficulties. Overextension destroys empires unable to concentrate force everywhere simultaneously. Wellington's legacy extends beyond military reputation. His Peninsular campaign became the model for defensive warfare and counterinsurgency. His later role at Waterloo and political career as Prime Minister secured his historical importance. But Peninsular War was his masterpiece, transforming from competent defensive general into commander who could win attacking when circumstances favored him. His quote captures his philosophy. "The whole art of war consists in getting at what is on the other side of the hill," meaning intelligence and understanding enemies matter more than tactics alone. Spain exemplified this perfectly. The final assessment balances perspectives. Wellington's strategic patience combined with Portuguese transformation and Spanish resistance defeated France over 6 years. The bleeding dry strategy worked. 200,000 French casualties proved it. Britain's financial support, Royal Navy supply guarantee, and Peninsular veterans' later Waterloo contribution completed the picture. Yet Spanish suffering, civilian deaths, and economic devastation remind us that strategic success involves immense human cost. Napoleon later admitted Spain was his greatest mistake, the wound that never healed whilst he fought elsewhere. Modern parallels to counterinsurgency operations, occupation resistance, and the limits of military power make Peninsular War relevant beyond historical interest. Popular resistance makes occupation unsustainable regardless of military superiority. Patience can defeat speed if political will sustains it. Local allies matter decisively. Some wars can't be won quickly. Spain proved these lessons between 1808 and 1814, bleeding Napoleon's empire slowly, methodically, completely. The Spanish ulcer destroyed French power not through climactic triumph, but through 6 years of grinding attrition that Wellington, Portuguese allies, and Spanish guerrillas inflicted daily until France had nothing left to give.